Hi, I'm Christy. I'm a registered psychotherapist and naturopathic doctor, and this is Conversations with Clients, where we chat about things that have come up in session in hopes that they are helpful to you as well. So today's chat was with a client who came in and he was really pissed at himself. He had behaved in this way that he really didn't like, and he was really getting angry at this part of himself that kind of shows up in the world that way sometimes. And he was talking about how dark and bad and awful this part was. And then he asked, "Is that my shadow?" Which led us to chatting about shadow work, shadow self, the whole shadow realm. So the idea of a shadow self was put forward by Carl Jung, who was a psychiatrist in the late 1800s, early to mid 1900s. He was a protege of Freud and was really inspired by a lot of Freud's ideas of the ego and the id. And kind of building on those ideas, he put forward that we have two basic facets of our personality. We have our shadow self and we have our ideal self. And I'm putting ideal self in quotation marks because the ideal self has a lot of baggage. It is not our highest self or our best self or even our ideal. It's really kind of a manifestation or a representation of society's ideals. So our ideal self is the self that we show the world. It's often what we identify with, what we call I, and it's what we're often most conscious of. On the flip side, our shadow self is what we hide from the world and also largely from ourself. It tends to be repressed and largely unconscious. And to the extent that we do catch glimpses of it or become aware of it, our ideal self usually looks upon it with a lot of criticism or contempt or judgment. And so shadow work, in Jung's opinion, was about bringing the shadow into the light, making the darkness conscious, as he was kind of famous for saying. And, there's a lot in that even, a century later still holds up. We still understand that there are repressed and unconscious parts of ourselves and that a lot of healing happens in reclaiming those parts. That being said, I hate the term shadow work. I think I hate it for two reasons. The first is that it did come out of Freud's idea of the id, which was this really dark, sordid, bad part of ourself that we were supposed to overcome or override. And without getting up on too much of a high horse around Freud, just a lot has changed about our understanding of the mind since then. And even besides Freud, the term shadow just so easily associates into ideas of something that is dark and bad and ominous. And it's kind of ironic that, thinking about parts of ourselves as dark and bad and ironic is what caused them to be repressed in the first place. So it feels a little bit unhelpful, but it's also untrue. It is untrue that there are parts of ourselves that are dark and bad and ominous. Which brings us to the number one maxim of working with parts, which is there are no bad parts. If it exists within us, it exists for a reason. Parts of us, our ideal self, may not like it, but that doesn't make it bad. Ultimately, there are only really two kinds of parts. There are unwounded parts and there are wounded parts. Wounded parts have been injured, and often in response, they have adapted. The same way my tissue might adapt and change in response to injury, it might become thicker or calloused or form scar tissue. Parts of us may change in response to injury. Their roles or behaviors may change. They may adapt. They may change in a way that helps us survive the environment that we're in. Which brings us to the number two maxim of working with parts, which is if it's happening for a reason. Nature doesn't do anything in vain. If it's happening, there is a purpose to it. And our job is to understand what that purpose is. Not to judge it or criticize it or exile it, but to understand the function it's serving. And to the extent that that function is somehow serving the protection of a wound, which it usually is, to heal that wound. So if we come back to my client, there was actually kind of two parts of him that were showing up. And because psychological concepts and constructs can be so abstract, I often use props. So, there was the part that had behaved badly, and there was the part that hated the part that had behaved badly. So we were talking about these in session as the hater and the hated. And it was actually, the hater that was most present in session. That was what was kind of drawing a lot of energy of how mad he was at this part. So since the hater was the one that was kind of showing up most, we started there, and starting from a place of there are no bad parts, so hater's not bad, and if it's happening for a reason, so there must be a reason the hater's hating, we started to kind of explore what that reason is. And as we did, these memories of childhood started to come up, and memories specifically around how other people in his life had treated the badly behaved one with a lot of hate or contempt. And, these memories kind of gave us a lot of understanding of the hated. It was like we were starting to get his origin story. We were learning how the hater learned to hate. And as we continued to kind of be curious about the role that was serving, the purpose it was serving, it really became clear that the hater did have a very specific purpose. Its one job in life was to bully and absolutely rip apart the badly behaved one in an attempt to get rid of it. His job was just to smoosh it into non-existence. And again, no bad part, so hater's not bad. If it's happening for a reason, so there must be something important about getting rid of the badly behaved one. So I asked the question, what are you worried would happen if you didn't get rid of the badly behaved one? And almost instantly, I'll never be loved. And I said, well, shit. If that's what's on the line here, if that's what the stakes are, no wonder you're working so hard to get rid of the badly behaved one. Being loved, being accepted, being belonging is one of our most fundamental, most basic needs. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if that need is not getting met, we're below the emotional poverty line. So no wonder you're working so hard to get rid of anything that might compromise your ability to get that need met. It's happening for a reason. That makes sense, right? Now, do I think this part is right? Do I think it's true that if he doesn't get rid of parts of himself, he'll never be loved? No. But that's the wound. That's what this part learned and what he adapted to. That was what made sense in the environment he grew up in, right? And if we can heal that wound, well, I don't know that the hater's natural state is hard eyes. We haven't gotten that far yet. But if we can heal that wound, the hater can go back to the function he was naturally intended to have, the one he had before he had to take on the role of being the hater. So I'm hoping that gives you some sense that it's just a little bit more complicated than, just an ideal self and a shadow self. The hater had his own shadow. He had his own unconscious wound that he was carrying that was influencing how he shows up in the world, right? And we didn't even get to the part that was getting all the shade thrown at him, right? And undoubtedly, this part has his own wounds and hurts and injuries that will need to be healed. So if it was up to me, I would get rid of the term shadow work completely. There are no shadow parts. There are parts of ourselves that have been made to live in the shadows, not because they were bad or dark, but because we've had experiences where they were unwanted. And so in order for us to still be wanted, we exiled them, we banished them so that we could still belong, so that we could still get that need met, so that we weren't below the emotional poverty line. And certainly there is a lot of healing that happens in reclaiming those parts, in bringing them back into the light. It makes me think of one of my favorite definitions of healing, which came from a Buddhist teacher named Stephen Levine. And he said, if there is a single definition of healing, it is to touch with mercy and awareness those pains from which we have withdrawn in judgment and dismay. And it's in that withdrawing in judgment and dismay that we leave parts in the shadows. And it is with touching with mercy and awareness that we reclaim them, that we heal, that we become whole again. So that's my rant on why shadow work needs a rebrand. I hope that was helpful. If you have questions, I may have answers. I'll certainly try. Put them in the comment section below. I would love to hear from you. Take care.